Nigel, thank you for coming. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Berlin. It's now been a year since I've stood on any election platform. And the last time I stood on a platform was in a southern state called Mississippi on the 18th of August last year with somebody called Donald J. Trump, who I'm pleased to say is now the President of the United States of America. And I mention that because I think when historians look back at the West and its progress up and its progress down, I think 2016 will be one of those great stand-out years. One of those years in which two remarkable events happened. The first, and I still sometimes have to pinch myself to realize that it actually happened, but the first, of course, took place on June the 23rd in the United Kingdom in 2016, and it was called Brexit. And it happened despite the fact that our major so-called political parties all said we should vote to remain. It happened in spite of our major broadcast media clearly favouring one side of the argument over another. It happened in the face of the entire trade union movement saying we should vote to remain, and all the big businesses saying we should vote to remain, and all of the so-called business organisations saying we should vote to remain, and Mrs. Merkel saying we should vote to remain, and Jean-Claude Juncker daring to say nothing because he knew, no, Juncker knew if he'd turned up, he'd have put us up a couple of points. And of course, the President, Barack Obama, came to the United Kingdom, sneered down his nose at us, and said, if you dare vote to become an independent, proud, sovereign, self-governing, democratic nation, we will put you to the back of the queue. And do you know what we thought when we were being spoken to by global leaders and liberal media and establishment politicians and being told that we weren't big enough, we weren't strong enough, we weren't good enough to run our own country and make our own decisions? We thought, the hell with all of you. And it was that seismic shock of Brexit that led on to the events in the United States of America on the 8th of November last year. And again, it was the same playbook, wasn't it? It's impossible. Trump can't win. The media hated him. The unions hated him. The big banks hated him. The multinationals hated him. Many, in fact, in his own Republican Party hated him. And yet he stood for a message. And it was a message that there is nothing wrong with being proud of having a nation state. There is nothing wrong in being proud of having your own flag. There is nothing wrong or shameful in government standing up and defending not just its own people, but indeed its own culture. I haven't drunk water for years. And it was a message that resonated. And the more they attacked him, the better he did. And he won. And again, it was another massive seismic shock in Western politics. Now, there are those that will tell you, and I hear them when I'm in the lift in the European Parliament in Strasbourg. I think they say it for my benefit. They say, it's all going to be okay. The populist revolt of 2016 is over and normal service will be resumed. Indeed, Tony Blair now goes around the world spreading this message to anyone that cares to listen. Well, at least he's not taking us into illegal wars anymore, which is something, I suppose. But do not listen to these doommongers. They say, Monsieur Macron won in France. It proves the revolt is finished. What they don't see is that in the first round of the French presidential elections, 46.5% of voters voted for candidates who were hardline in their opposition to the European Union, something that was completely and totally unthinkable just 10 years ago. So this bow wave that has come off the extraordinary events of 2016 is still rolling. And there is something that I think is of equal significance that is about to happen here in Germany too. Now, I don't have any formal ties with the AfD as a political party, so I'm not coming here to suggest what people should do. But I am coming here as somebody who's been invited by Beatrix von Storck, somebody that I knew years before she was into elected politics in the European Parliament, someone that I know has got good, sound, decent principles and wants things that are right for her country and its future and the rest of Europe too. And I regard Beatrix as a friend. I believe we have strong, shared, similar values, and I think it'll be a great thing to see you in the Bundestag in a couple of weeks' time. And for the first time in modern history, there is going to be a voice of opposition in the national Parliament in Germany, and they're very, very scared of this happening indeed. They really are. So it is a big moment and it is an important moment. Of course, the battle for Chancellor is altogether, I guess, another issue. Now, Mrs. Merkel and I have not met on that many occasions. The last time was when she was in the European Parliament, and I was having, I thought it was quite a polite discussion, personally, about the complete failure of the Eurozone and the fact that the north and south of Europe, far from being brought together in harmony and friendship, do you remember? All these high ideals that the European Union was supposed to promote, when in fact it's driven the north and south apart. And it's a shame, really, that the last time we met was before her decision on the migrant crisis, because I would so have liked in public to tell her that what she did in saying we can take anyone that can come was probably the worst decision by any national Western leader in modern political history. But nonetheless, we just had the Euro to discuss that day, and when I gave her my comments on how I thought she was providing leadership in Europe, I have to say, she looked at me with some considerable mounting degree of horror. In fact, she looked like she was sucking a lemon. She really wasn't very happy. And then, of course, there's Martin Schulz. Hey, you've got no right to boo. I know him. Schulz is a fanatic, a total and utter fanatic. He believes that the European project should be imposed upon the peoples of Europe whether they want it or not. He is a very, very dangerous man in this belief. He really is. There are some, if I say so myself, fairly epic exchanges to be found on YouTube of Martin Schulz and I exchanging commentary with each other in the European Parliament. But you know, the funny thing about this election, and the funny thing that being a member of the European Union in many ways does to national democratic politics, is it means you may finish up with two different personalities, but you finish up with both offering the same menu, because both of these candidates believe the euro has been a great success. Both of these candidates were completely behind the Merkel call that anyone should come, and Schulz himself, despite pretending in that television debate last Sunday to be concerned about how long integration would take in Germany for 1 million plus people, Schulz himself condemned out of hand anyone that dared criticise the Merkel policy at that time. So I think whoever becomes the next Chancellor, and it probably is going to be Angela Merkel, I guess, the choice is the Germans at that level are not having a proper debate, which is why Beatrix and her colleagues getting into the Bundestag is such an important historic moment. You see, I've done this before. I've been there. I've lived through what is about to happen here. I got involved in UKIP right at the very beginning. I got involved in UKIP as somebody that had never been involved in politics in his life. In fact, and in some ways, in political circles, this is almost a confession. Because, folks, before I was in politics, I had a proper job in the real world. How about that? How about that? Yeah, remarkable, isn't it? Remarkable. I mean, certainly British politics for the last few years has been dominated by the same people who go to the same handful of schools, the same Oxford College, do the same degree, and then marry each other's sisters. I mean, that's what British politics has become over the last few years. People who've never had a proper job in their life and have no connection with ordinary people. Again, it's part of why Brexit happened. But I spent 20 years in the metals business, the non-ferrous metals business. So Germany is very well known to me. There's hardly a town in the Rhineland or the Ruhr that I did not visit in the 1980s and the 1990s. I got motivated to getting into politics because I actually believed that far from the European Union single market and its at the time planned single currency being good for business, I took the view that it was good only for big business. It was good for the multinationals. It was good for the giant banks. But it was never going to be good for the man or woman that wants to set up their own company, the man or woman that wants to be an entrepreneur, the small or medium-sized company that wants to take on and challenge the big boys. So I decided in the early 1990s that I just couldn't go on supporting conventional politics, that I had to do something about this. The difficulty was that at the time I made that decision, virtually everybody that I knew in business, socially, in my village in Kent, my parents, my friends, my family, even my young children, thought I must be mad, thought I must have caught something or smoked something funny, because I was talking about an issue that nobody else was talking about. I was talking about something that was considered to be a minority sport. And through all those early years, I remember people saying, Nigel, you can say what you like, but it is inevitable that Britain will join the euro. It is inevitable that we will finish up with the United States of Europe. And the problem when you have a strong view and a strong belief, the problem is, how do you get it out to people? How do you get round the back of mainstream media that won't, frankly, give you a look in? How do you manage to get an objective debate going on any of these issues? And in our case, I guess, it took us a quarter of a century, and it took us the advent of the internet to achieve those goals. But once we were able, with YouTube to begin with, where my exchanges with people like Herman Van Rompuy would be, and I'd go round the back of the BBC and they'd be seen by millions of people. So the advent of the internet allowed us to get there. But the point, folks, is this. Once you have the opportunity, once you have the space, once you have the territory to challenge the establishment status quo, you have the ability to make the country think. And Beatrix, that is both the opportunity but also the responsibility that you will take from Berlin and from your supporters to the next big step in your life. You and the others with you have a fantastic opportunity in the one country which is the biggest country in Europe, is the strongest country in Europe, is the most influential country in Europe. And also, of course, because of you generous German taxpayers, and you are so generous, being the biggest contributors to the European Union budget as well. But my point is that once you're able to speak the unspeakable, people will begin to think the unthinkable, and that is how you beat the establishment. But there is one very important and I think totally absent dimension from this German election campaign. It is obvious to everybody that the biggest event in the last year or two within the European Union, indeed the biggest event that has happened since the Treaty of Rome was signed back in 1957, is Brexit, is it not? You may think it's a good thing. Hooray! You may think it's a bad thing, Mr. Schulz. But it doesn't matter whether you think Brexit's a good thing or a bad thing. It is the biggest challenge the European Union has ever faced. And in some ways, for us, it's a challenge that we've not faced the like of for some years. It is for us a major constitutional change. We're going back to doing things the way we did successfully for centuries. I don't have a problem with that. I really don't. It makes sense to me. But there is a negotiation that is going on. And this is all being portrayed, folks, as if Brexit could be a catastrophe for the United Kingdom. A total catastrophe. We're told that if we leave the single market and there is no tariff-free deal, that it'll be like us and our economy falling off a cliff. This is the analogy that is used. We're told that nobody will trade with us. We're told that Europe, the market, will be closed to us. We're told millions of people will lose their jobs. There'll be people starving in the streets, and plagues of black locusts will come down from upon high. It'll be a disaster, we're told, if we're not part of this single market. So isn't it remarkable that if this is the argument that is being put by the big multinationals, if this is the argument being put by the big banks, if this is the argument being put by the European Commission, substantial parts of the liberal media, and many leaders in Brussels and the rest of Europe, if Brexit is that serious, if not having a tariff-free deal is that disastrous for Britain, why is this not being debated in Germany also? Because trade is a two-way street. Trade affects both of us. And in the case of the relationship between Germany and the United Kingdom, I would suggest politely, in your company, there is something of an imbalance. Now listen to this, please, it's important. You in Germany, because we like your cars, and we like your washing machines, and we believe, no we do, we believe that something that says made in Germany represents good engineering and good pricing and good product. That is a massive consumer perception in the United Kingdom. And it really is. It really is. And I always say to people when they tell me that it would be a disaster if we left the United Kingdom, they won't trade with us. And I say, look out of your window. Watch the next 100 cars that drive past and count how many were manufactured in Germany. The point is, you sell us more than we sell you, 30 billion euros worth of goods every single year. 30 billion. In some years, the figure is higher than that. I'm choosing actually one of the lower year numbers from the last few years. There are 1.3 million German people working in well-paid jobs who have a direct link and interest into cars and washing machines and other products continuing to be sold in the United Kingdom. So if a breach with the single market, if an ending of non-tariffs is a catastrophe for the United Kingdom, you would agree, if that proposition was true, it's pretty serious for Germany too, isn't it? Isn't it? So we have a shared common interest. The British people and the German people have a shared common interest in Brexit being negotiated successfully. Please do not think that Brexit, as it's portrayed by many parts of the German media and others, oh, and by the way, can I just say that I've just been nice about your engineers, haven't I? And nice about your car makers. Well, I'm going to be really nasty about the German media, who offer no sensible, balanced argument on the European issue or anything else. Because they all seem to represent just one side of the argument, which is very, very sad. But I find it remarkable. You know, even if having tariffs were to come back, do you know something? We'd still buy and sell goods from each other. We just might buy and sell fewer of them. Either way, it's in both of our interests for this deal to work. And yet, in this German election campaign, even with your big TV debate that happened last Sunday, which was watched by, amazing, 20 million Germans watched that debate. Must have got pretty bored halfway through, but anyway. But 20 million people watched that debate, and at no point in time did Brexit come up. Merkel won't discuss Brexit. Schulz won't discuss Brexit. They won't talk about it because it's a huge embarrassment for the European dream that both of them have had. But think about what is happening, folks, with Brexit. We are saying no to political union. We are not saying no to European cooperation. Far from it. We want to trade with Europe. We want to cooperate with Germany and France and the rest of Europe. We want to have reciprocity and student exchanges, and we want to work together to combat drugs, people trafficking, terrorism, pollution. We want to be your absolute best next-door neighbours and your friends. We just don't want to be governed by the old men who no one's ever voted for, who occupy those glass and steel structures with their massive salaries and their huge lunches and their even bigger pensions in Brussels. That is what we're saying. And yet, it is those very people, Juncker, Barnier, Verhofstadt, it is those people in Brussels who are doing all they can to make sure that Brexit doesn't happen. They have put already a series of impossible demands on the table. They have shown no goodwill to negotiate a deal of any kind at all. And yet, they are acting in supposedly your interests. But they're not acting in your interests. They are acting in their interests. And this has become and this is the problem, folks, with the European project. However well-intentioned and sensible it was back in the 1950s to get countries to reconcile after the terrible things that had happened, it has now become a living, breathing organism of its own that acts in its own interests. And if it denies a sensible trade deal to the United Kingdom, it also denies that deal to German car workers in Bavaria and washing machine manufacturers in the Rhine and the Ruhr elsewhere. They are not acting in the common good for Europe. They're acting to preserve their own empires. They're acting to preserve their own way of life. And with 2 weeks to go, I would urge Beatrix and others to challenge these people, to make Brexit a debate that matters. And you've got the opportunity to stand up for the rights and interests of German workers and German families. And you know something? When I stood on that stage in Mississippi last year with that New York businessman called Donald J. Trump, he decided he would put the interests of American workers and American companies first. And just look what that did for his result. So you've an opportunity electorally to do well out of this, but you've also got an opportunity, I think, to do something bigger and better and greater for the people of Germany. Merkel needs to know that unless she acts, unless she tells Brussels, look, please come to a common sense accommodation, then she will be putting the interests of Brussels above that of ordinary German people. Merkel needs she will need over the next few years, a huge degree of pressure put upon her. I have always taken the view that it is very difficult to reform the European Union. But if any one country could, post-Brexit, change its direction, recognise the integrity of democratic nation states, it would be Germany that did it because of your sheer size and your sheer influence. But none of it will happen. None of it will happen unless the establishment get threatened, unless the establishment get challenged, unless the establishment get scared. And the only way that happens is for ordinary people from all walks of life to stand up and to fight for what they believe in. And I've stood up and fought for what I've believed in, and I hope you will do the same too. And I thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. This is what we expected from you. There's always some fresh air coming in wherever you are. So thank you for this. I'm going to switch to German, and we have a translation for you. The floor is open. Wir haben jemanden von unserer Seite, der das Mikrofon führt. Wo ist das Mikrofon für Fragen? Das haben Sie. Sie mögen sich melden, das Mikrofon kommt zu Ihnen. Das Mikrofon bleibt immer in der Hand von uns und wird nicht aus der Hand gegeben. Das hat sich bewährt dafür, dass die Fragen mehr Fragen werden und weniger Co-Referate. Und dann gibt es Antworten. Bitte sehr.
Mein Name ist Axel Engler, guten Tag. Ich habe eine Frage bezüglich einem möglichen Wahlbetrug. Wir haben letztes Jahr gesehen, dass millionenfach in Amerika Trump um Stimmen betrogen wurde. Jetzt ging hier kürzlich durch die Presse, dass auch in Deutschland irgendwelche Hacker die Bundestagswahl eventuell beeinflussen können, natürlich zum Nachteil sehr wahrscheinlich der AfD. Wie hoch schätzen Sie diese Gefahr ein? Und wenn sie bestehen würde, was denken Sie, kann man dagegen tun?
Sie fragen jetzt mich, die Gefahr besteht, dagegen rufen wir auf, gehen Sie um 5:45 wählen, bleiben Sie bis um 6 im Wahllokal, seien Sie selber Wahlbeobachter, beachten Sie, ob richtig ausgezählt wird oder nicht. Das ist der Aufruf, den wir machen können.
Can I make a wider point, Beatrix? No, that's a very good point. There is a wider point here that is very, very interesting. And it's called, and the term varies depending where you are. Some people call it postal voting, others call it early voting. Now, we used to have a system where if you were 98 years old, or in a wheelchair, or you worked abroad, you could apply to vote by post. And about 2.5% of the electorate voted by post. Then Tony Blair said, oh, no, 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 we're going to extend that franchise. And now about 20% vote by post, and I understand in Germany the figure is very similar. Postal voting is open to massive fraud and to intimidation as well. And I know that in many of the Muslim communities in Britain, the women in those households, if they're signed up to postal votes, will be very lucky if they get to make the decision themselves. I know when postal votes are being delivered door to door, of knocks on the door and intimidation. And I tell you what, one of the lovely things about Europe is we can all learn things from each other. And the French do get some things right. Maybe not Macron, but they do get some things right, and the French have no postal voting. If you want to register a vote in France, you go down to the polling station on the Sunday of the election and you register that vote. And I think getting rid of early postal voting would reduce the elements of fraud, reduce the elements of intimidation, and anyway, what a farce it is if a fifth of the electorate vote 2 weeks before the final weekend debate. It makes no sense at all. I put it forward, I suggest it as a start. Not a solution to everything, but it would at least begin, would it not, to give us a fairer, level playing field for everybody.
Nigel, a brilliant speech. You are great on YouTube. You are even better live. Thank you very much, and also a special thanks to Mrs. Schulz to bring you here. My question is, what's your comment on the decision of the European High Court to force Hungary and Slovakia to settle African and other migrants in Northern Europe?
Do you know something? Had the European Union stayed at, I don't know, 12, maybe 15 countries, and had the Eurozone been restricted to Germany and the northern Benelux countries, I don't think the Union would face the crises that it does today. But the Union made 2 or 3 fundamental errors, all based on hubris, in my opinion. The first was to allow 8 and then 10 former communist countries to join the European Union before they were ready and before many of them had made the transition to full Western democracy. The second was to allow the Mediterranean to join the Eurozone despite the warnings of every sensible Dutch and German economist. But we now have an amazing situation where the continent is divided north to south by the euro, with the north beginning to feel quite resentful about their money being used to prop up bailout after bailout, and the south looking at unemployment rates amongst their youth of 40 and 50% and wondering what's happened. But now we have a cultural east-west split. The 4 countries that are really interesting, you mentioned Hungary, sir, but the 4 countries that are really interesting are, well, it's Hungary, it's Poland, it's the Czech Republic, and it's Slovakia. And recently, a very well-known BBC commentator said, when you listen to the prime ministers of those 4 countries talking about migration, he said they make Nigel Farage sound like a Foreign Office diplomat. These countries have lived under oppression. They've lived under communism. They've craved, if you like, their own independence for all those years. They are devout Roman Catholic countries with strong Christian values. And for them, it's a simple issue. The issue is they are worried that a large, rapid rise of Islamic immigration will not lead to integration. It'll lead to separation and division, and they're having none of it. And so the European Court this week ruled, you must do what Juncker says. You must do what Merkel says. And they're saying, no, we won't do it. What do I think about it? It's their sovereign right to make their own blooming minds up about who does or does not come into their countries, and I admire Viktor Orban, who I think at the moment is the strongest and best leader in the whole of Europe.
Mr. Farage, nice to see you. Dröse aus Leipzig, eine Frage an Sie. Die Menschen in Europa wollen eigentlich keine neue Sowjetunion. Wenn der Herr Juncker, von Ihnen mehrfach schon erwähnt, eines Tages zur Besinnung kommt und das dann auch nicht mehr möchte und er bei Ihnen nach Rat fragt, was würden Sie ihm denn empfehlen?
Well, my advice to Mr. Juncker would be, drink less at I mean, I like a glass of wine, but there are limits, you know. I'm sorry, Beatrix, I said I'd try and behave, but it's difficult. Do you know something? I've been in that parliament 18 years, and I've been a group leader for 10 years. So I've got to know lots of the big bosses over the years, the Barrosos, the Van Rompuys. He's not speaking to me at all, Van Rompuy. But I've got to know lots of them over the years. And do you know something? In some ways, Juncker is by far the most interesting of all of them. Why do I say that? Because as Prime Minister of Luxembourg, which he was for nearly 20 years, don't doubt one thing, he did a brilliant job for the Luxembourg people. He might now talk about European rules and regulations and you must all do what we say. Didn't do it as boss of Luxembourg, did he? I mean, he's created this tax haven in the middle of Europe, where cigarettes are almost free, petrol costs virtually nothing, and there's no tax. I mean, it's amazing what Juncker did. So, as a political operator, I admire him. But, and this, I think, folks, goes to the heart of something which is perhaps a more difficult conversation in Germany. Juncker believes that the reason we had 2 world wars was because we had nation states in Europe, and that therefore if we abolish nation states there'll be peace, love, happiness, motherhood and apple pie and all the rest of it forever. And it is understandable why people in the 1950s should have looked for a way to make the world a better place. It's just that they've drawn the wrong conclusion. It is not the existence of nation state that leads to war. It is the absence or the breakdown of democracy in nation state that leads to these things happening. So Juncker is stuck with a wildly outdated view of the world. And you know, it's very interesting this, and you try this, because I've tried this for 25 years, and no one yet has done me in on it. Give me one example. Just give me one example of a mature, functioning democracy going to war with another mature, functioning democracy. It has never happened, and it will never happen. And if we want Europe to be a happy and peaceful and successful place for our grandchildren and those that come after us, what we should be championing is not the artificiality of Brussels. It is proud, independent, democratic, functioning European states with their identities and their proud friendships with their neighbours. That's my Europe.
Mr. Farage, thank you very much for your great speech. I would like to ask a question concerning internal security. A few years ago, we have learned about the so-called Rotherham scandal in the UK, which was already incomplete information from our media, because it was not only a Rotherham scandal, it was a whole Middle England scandal concerning also Bristol, Telford, Aylesbury, Oxford and many other Middle English cities. My question is, do you think that such a thing is also possible in Germany under the conditions of this immigration of Muslim young men? And what could we do in order to avoid it, as we have no, as you correctly said, no balanced media, and we have no Daily Mail in Germany?
Yeah, well, I have to say the Daily Mail can be really good news, unless they're writing about you as the individual, then it's a bit different. Well, I think you've been through a similar experience, sir. Because am I not right in saying that 2 Christmas Eves ago, outside the train station in Cologne, one of the very stations where people stood that previous summer with signs, do you remember those signs? Refugees welcome, Merkel is right. And wasn't it outside one of those very same stations where, you know, a mass sexual assaults took place on a huge industrial scale? And wasn't that shut up by the German media and indeed the German police? Didn't it take days for the Western world to find out the truth of what had happened in Cologne? Well, I'm sorry, folks, but I think it did. So we're seeing a bit of the same problem. The Rotherham, what happened in Rotherham, I mean, it's just on such a scale, it is difficult to believe. You know, Rotherham is not a particularly big northern town. It's a middle-sized northern town. And you're talking about 1,200 underage girls and 7,000 perpetrators. I mean, the sheer scale of this, you know, in a town with a population of 150,000, it's almost beyond belief. And what we've had there, and we've now had admissions. You know, one of the former MPs said, well, we didn't want to look too closely because we were scared of being thought to be racist. And it's rather like Beatrice's comment about bishops putting down their crosses and not being seen to be too overtly Christian. What we need are leaders who are robust enough to stand up and to defend the Judeo-Christian culture upon which Western civilization was built. But please, can I add something else that I think is very, very important? We know that a lot has gone wrong within Islam over the last few years. We know a lot of the financing that has come out of a couple of Middle Eastern countries that has pushed certain agendas. You know, I mean, nobody in many of these Middle Eastern countries 20 years ago would you see a woman wearing a burqa. This is all quite recent stuff. Some very extreme strains of Islam have been planted out there. I will say this to all of you, and you can agree with me or disagree with me. But to confront Islamic terrorism, which is the biggest threat the world faces today, and to confront the division and the unhappiness in our cities and communities, I repeat, we have to be strong in standing up for who we are and what we are. But part of who we are and what we are means that we also believe in religious freedom and religious tolerance. And if we choose to go to war with the whole religion of Islam, we will lose. We will lose. And why? Because we have to recognize that actually there are lots and lots of people of an Islamic religion living in our countries who want their kids to play football with our kids, who want to get on in our society. We must take out the bad people. But if we demonize absolutely everybody, if we create martyrs within that, genuine martyrs that are seen by the moderates, that somehow there's now a cultural war going on between the two religions, then we will lose. We have to be clever about how we approach this. We have to be strong and robust, but we have to do everything we can to get the good men and women who have an Islamic religion to be bolder and braver, as we have to be braver in standing up and condemning atrocities.
Hello, Mr. Farage. Thanks for coming. I had a question for you regarding diversity. So basically, what we're seeing more and more is that all kind of left-wing, progressive so-called parties are pushing this idea of diversity. The real diversity, however, that seems to be lacking in all of these parties is really the diversity of thought. Especially in my generation, I'm somebody in the millennial generation, somebody who really sticks out. I walk through my neighborhoods and I see the posters of the AfD ripped, torn apart. I see people, I've called the police on people in my generation who are defacing AfD posters and thinking it's the coolest thing. What do we do to really address that lack of intellectual diversity, that lack of diversity of thought, especially in the younger generations where basically what used to be the counterculture, leftist, progressive ideology, the 60s and counterculture, where now basically that's become the establishment, and people in my generation really think that anything but being completely left-wing on all issues is hateful, bigoted, and racist, regardless of whether you yourself are a member of so-called marginalized groups.
Yeah, excellent point. Very well made. No, very, very well made. We have completely forgotten that tolerance is a two-way street. We've forgotten that. I mean, gay marriage is a very good example in my country. So David Cameron was elected in 2010 without it being in the manifesto, not there. Stonewall, the leading gay charity in the United Kingdom, over 50 years old, were not campaigning for gay marriage. We'd had a system of civil partnerships which everybody thought was fair and respectful and decent. But David Cameron says, no, 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 no. I'm going to rush legislation through the House of Commons to enable gay marriage. He did it. Thereafter, anyone who said they weren't in favour of gay marriage was guilty of a hate crime. And that is how they change the agenda. And a two-way street, a tolerant society that believes in free speech, liberty and tolerance, respects the rights of gay people, but equally respects the rights of those for whom they don't particularly approve. That is how a tolerant two-way street works. How do we get there? Do you know something? I talked earlier about the huge battle we have against the establishment class, modern global corporatism. You know, the multinationals, the big selfish banks, big politics, big media, all of that. The educational establishment should be second on our list, and frankly, most of it needs to be torn down, and we need to start again. Our universities across the West are poisoning the minds of young people by not teaching them objectively and fairly.
Nigel Farage, thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much to Beatrice also for the invitation. Fantastic talk. You know, I want to pick up on a lot of things that kind of come together in your talk, and that is, how is it possible to even confront Islam, the lack of diversity of thought, European integration and opinions about the necessity for the EU, when the media, something you started with, right, with your talk, the media is so difficult in Germany. How do you roll back the hate laws, the hate speech laws that have been enacted in Germany by Justice Minister Heiko Maas that make it illegal to question things like Islam, to say, I have a completely different opinion, which might be Christian, for example? How can hate speech regulations that have been brought in Germany and at the European level be rolled back? And does Germany need a First Amendment, not like the United States, so people here can be free to think and free to talk?
Yes, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's more difficult in Germany than it was in the United Kingdom, and to get to where we got to was a hell of a battle. I'm not pretending this is easy, but you see, to do this, to really answer your question, it's a very short answer actually, you need people to challenge this who are brave, but you also need people to challenge this who are also wise and who realize how far they can push the argument up to the line without, frankly, being chucked in jail. And that is how you're going to have to do it here in Germany, and you're going to have to do it through, chiefly the internet. And then do you know what happens? What begins to happen is some of the local radio stations begin to think, do you know something? We've just done a survey. A majority of our listeners, we didn't realise, they actually believe in traditional values. And suddenly they start to go in that direction because they start to get more listeners. And do you know what happens when they get more listeners? They get more advertising and they earn more money. And what I saw happen, you know, I saw sections of the media in the United Kingdom who 10 or 15 years ago painted me out as the devil, who now think it's a jolly good thing we've left the European Union and we jolly well must control our borders, and they've completely changed their opinion. In the end, slowly but surely, you can get the market to change this, but you need bold and wise leaders. And it's why I said earlier, when I talked about Beatrix here in Berlin, heading off to the Bundestag, that while she's got a tremendous and fantastic opportunity, she also has a tremendous weight of responsibility on her shoulders. But I know her well enough to know that she's both bold and wise.
Letzte Frage.
Nigel, you correctly pointed out that Brexit was noticeably absent from the debates. Something else that was noticeably absent for me as an American was the Ukraine and Russia issue. I would like to hear you speak about where you see Germany as kind of this pivot point between Russia and the United States. There are a lot of people in my country who would say that Russia right now is one of the preeminent threats to European security. So if you could speak to this a bit, I'd appreciate that.
Look, I think, you know, a proper debate on Russia takes hours. All I will say is this. I wouldn't want to live in modern-day Russia. I certainly wouldn't want to be a journalist in modern-day Russia. But I think the way the West has attempted to demonize Putin is frankly ridiculous, almost verging on the childish. They hate Putin because he's a strong national leader. They don't believe in things like that. And I will add this. I think the attempt by the European Union and by NATO to extend to the east and to take the Ukraine into their orbit was a very, very stupid strategic mistake. If you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised when a claw comes back and tries to have a go at you. All right?
So, ein ganz großes Dankeschön an Nigel Farage. Vielen Dank, dass Sie gekommen sind und Gast gewesen sind. Ich glaube, wenn man jetzt noch viele Worte macht, dann kann man es nicht mehr besser machen. Deswegen will ich es wirklich kurz machen. Ich möchte mich sehr herzlich bedanken. And I didn't know whether you drink alcohol or not. This is why I have a different present, which are cigars, to say thank you for coming, Nigel. Thank you.